At 0700 on July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye to the periscope of USS Barb through the thin circle of glass. He watched the Japanese supply train move along the Karafuto coastline. 6 trains per day, 40 to 60 soldiers per train. A steady flow of ammunition and reinforcements feeding Japan's northern defenses. Fluckey wasn't just observing. He was calculating. At 31 years old, he had already completed 5 war patrols as Barb's commander, 17 enemy ships sent to the bottom, 1 Medal of Honor, 3 Navy Crosses, a reputation inside the Pacific Fleet for doing the impossible and surviving it. USS Barb wasn't an ordinary submarine. She displaced 2,400 tons submerged, carried a crew of 80 men. For presidential unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. But what made her dangerous wasn't her awards. It was her captain. 3 months earlier, Fluckey had taken Barb into Nam Quan Harbor, waters so shallow the submarine couldn't dive, minefields on both sides, Japanese destroyers guarding the entrance, 30 ships anchored inside what the enemy believed was an impenetrable defensive position. He attacked anyway. 10 torpedoes fired, 8 ships sunk, 0 American casualties. Pearl Harbor called it the most audacious submarine attack of the war. Fluckey called it Tuesday. But by mid-1945, something had changed. Japanese merchant shipping was disappearing. American submarines were running out of targets. The war was tightening around Japan's home islands. So Fluckey asked a dangerous question. What if a submarine could strike the land itself? Before Barb's 12th and final patrol, he made an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The Navy was testing the Mark 51 rocket launcher as an anti-kamikaze weapon for landing ships. 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, 10 pounds of high explosive each, 3-mile range. Fluckey convinced them to bolt one onto Barb's deck. That decision made USS Barb the only rocket-launching submarine in the United States Navy. On June 8, 1945, Barb left Midway loaded with 72 rockets and orders to raise hell along the Japanese coast. By June 20th, she was operating north of Hokkaido. 2 days later, at 0230 in the morning, Barb surfaced 3 miles offshore from the town of Sherry. Population, 20,000. Industrial target. Fluckey gave the order. 12 rockets screamed into the darkness. Factories erupted into flames. Barb submerged and vanished before Japan could respond. It was the first time in history a submarine launched rockets at a shore target. But Fluckey wasn't finished, because 3 weeks later, through his periscope, he saw something far more valuable than factories. He saw a train, and that train would lead to the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home soil during the entire Pacific War. At 0700 on July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye to the periscope of USS Barb through the thin circle of glass. He watched the Japanese supply train move along the Karafuto coastline. 6 trains per day, 40 to 60 soldiers per train. A steady flow of ammunition and reinforcements feeding Japan's northern defenses. Fluckey wasn't just observing. He was calculating. At 31 years old, he had already completed 5 war patrols as Barb's commander, 17 enemy ships sent to the bottom, 1 Medal of Honor, 3 Navy Crosses, a reputation inside the Pacific Fleet for doing the impossible and surviving it. USS Barb wasn't an ordinary submarine. She displaced 2,400 tons submerged, carried a crew of 80 men. For presidential unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. But what made her dangerous wasn't her awards. It was her captain. 3 months earlier, Fluckey had taken Barb into Nam Quan Harbor, waters so shallow the submarine couldn't dive, minefields on both sides, Japanese destroyers guarding the entrance, 30 ships anchored inside what the enemy believed was an impenetrable defensive position. He attacked anyway. 10 torpedoes fired, 8 ships sunk, 0 American casualties. Pearl Harbor called it the most audacious submarine attack of the war. Fluckey called it Tuesday. But by mid-1945, something had changed. Japanese merchant shipping was disappearing. American submarines were running out of targets. The war was tightening around Japan's home islands. So Fluckey asked a dangerous question. What if a submarine could strike the land itself? Before Barb's 12th and final patrol, he made an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The Navy was testing the Mark 51 rocket launcher as an anti-kamikaze weapon for landing ships. 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets. 10 pounds of high explosive each. 3-mile range. Fluckey convinced them to bolt one onto Barb's deck. That decision made USS Barb the only rocket-launching submarine in the United States Navy. On June 8, 1945, Barb left Midway loaded with 72 rockets and orders to raise hell along the Japanese coast. By June 20th, she was operating north of Hokkaido. 2 days later, at 0230 in the morning, Barb surfaced 3 miles offshore from the town of Sherry. Population, 20,000. Industrial target. Fluckey gave the order. 12 rockets screamed into the darkness. Factories erupted into flames. Barb submerged and vanished before Japan could respond. It was the first time in history a submarine launched rockets at a shore target. But Fluckey wasn't finished, because 3 weeks later, through his periscope, he saw something far more valuable than factories. He saw a train, and that train would lead to the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home soil during the entire Pacific War, the Psychological War. News of the rocket attack spread along Japan's northern coast. Fishermen reported explosions from the sea. Rail workers heard thunder at night. Factories went dark. Local defense commanders scrambled to explain how an American submarine could fire artillery at Japanese soil and vanish without trace. The Japanese Imperial Navy had promised protection of the homeland. Barb was proving otherwise. And then Fluckey saw the railway. The observation. July 1945. Barb lay periscope depth off Karafuto. Fluckey tracked coastal patterns. 6 trains daily. Supply movement consistent. Troop rotations regular. This wasn't random civilian traffic. It was military logistics. Japan's defensive line depended on it. Fluckey watched one locomotive rumble past. Steam pouring upward. Cars packed tight. And a thought formed. Rockets could damage buildings. Torpedoes could sink ships. But a train could be destroyed in a way that echoed far beyond steel and timber. He gathered his officers. What if, he said calmly, we blow up the tracks? Silence filled the control room. Submarines did not conduct land sabotage missions. That was Marine Raider territory. Or Army Rangers. Not sailors. Not submariners. Not in the final months of the Pacific War. Yet Fluckey wasn't asking permission. He was calculating feasibility. The plan begins. The railway line ran close to shore, sometimes less than 200 yards inland. If a small team landed at night, if they carried demolition charges, if they wired the tracks, if they triggered the explosion under a moving train, the impact would be enormous. But the risks? Catastrophic. Japanese patrols guarded the coastline. If captured, the crew would face torture or execution. If the submarine were discovered while surfaced, she could be shelled or depth charged in shallow water. There would be no reinforcement, no rescue, no air cover. Still, volunteers were requested. Fluckey didn't have to ask twice. 8 men stepped forward. Not ordered, not assigned. They volunteered. That detail mattered. The landing party. The team included 8 demolition specialists, a radio man, engine men, deck crew, a gunner's mate, sailors, not commandos. They trained quickly inside the cramped hull of Barb, studying diagrams, practicing fuse timing, reviewing signals. The explosive device was ingenious in its simplicity. A 55-pound scuttling charge. A pressure trigger system rigged to detonate when a train passed over. No remote control. No second chances. Once armed, it had to work, or the team would die for nothing. July 23, 1945. Night. Overcast sky. Minimal moonlight. Perfect conditions. Barb surfaced carefully off the Karafuto coast. Engines idling low. Lookout scanning for patrol boats. The landing party climbed into a small rubber raft. They carried the explosive charge, small arms, wire cutters, determination. Fluckey remained aboard, watching through binoculars. The raft slipped into black water, each paddle stroke silent, each man aware they were about to make history or disappear. They reached shore undetected. No alarms, no flares, no gunfire. The team moved inland. Every step through wet grass sounded too loud. They located the tracks, steel rails stretching north and south. The demolition specialists went to work. Charge position, wires connected, pressure switch armed, timing uncertain. They didn't know exactly when the next train would arrive. They retreated back toward shore and waited. Inside USS Barb, tension thickened. Fluckey checked his watch repeatedly. Minutes felt like hours. Then, in the distance, a low mechanical rumble. The team froze near the shoreline brush. Headlights appeared along the track. Steam rising. The train was coming. Inside the submarine, sonar picked up faint coastal vibrations. The locomotive rolled forward. Closer, closer. And then, a flash, a roar. The ground erupted. Metal twisted skyward. Rail cars launched off the track. Flames shot into the night. The shock wave echoed across the water. For a brief second, the coastline of Japan was lit like daylight. The team ran. Japanese soldiers shouted in confusion. But by the time search parties arrived, the Americans were already pushing off from shore. The raft cut through water desperately. Barb maneuvered closer. Hatches opened. Hands reached out. Every man made it back aboard. Not one casualty. Not one captured. Fluckey ordered immediate dive. Barb slipped beneath the surface as chaos erupted ashore. Behind them, a Japanese military train burned. The aftermath. The explosion killed and wounded dozens. Rail operations halted. Japanese coastal commanders panicked. An American submarine had landed troops on the home islands, blown up a train, and escaped. It was the only Allied ground combat action on the Japanese home islands during World War II, and it had been carried out by submariners. The psychological impact outweighed the physical damage. Because if a submarine crew could land, strike, and leave at will, what else could come from the sea? But the story doesn't end there, because Barb still carried rockets, still had torpedoes, and still had one final patrol left before the war would end. And what happened next would seal Eugene Fluckey's name into naval legend forever. The explosion behind them was still burning when USS Barb disappeared beneath the surface. Inside the control room, no one cheered. No one celebrated. Not yet. The ocean was shallow. Too shallow. Less than 100 feet in some areas. If Japanese patrol craft reacted quickly, if aircraft were launched, if coastal artillery had spotted their silhouette before diving, Barb would have nowhere to hide. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood calm, hand behind his back, listening. The sonar operator adjusted his headset. Every man on board waited for the sound they all feared. Propellers. Depth charges, pings, but for several long minutes, there was only silence. The tension below. Silence underwater is never peaceful. It's heavy, oppressive. Every creak of the hull sounds amplified. Every shifting tool feels like a dropped hammer. Barb moved slowly, carefully, engines barely turning. They could not risk high speed. High speed meant noise. Noise meant detection. The crew knew something historic had just happened, but history doesn't protect you from depth charges. Fluckey leaned over the navigation table. He calculated currents, coastal patrol patterns, likely Japanese response routes. He had pushed farther than any American submarine commander before him. Now, he had to bring his boat home. Japan reacts. On shore, chaos. The train lay twisted and burning. Rail cars overturned. Japanese soldiers shouting in confusion. Officers trying to piece together what had happened. Sabotage? Air attack? Internal resistance? The idea that an American submarine had landed men on Japanese soil felt impossible. But evidence said otherwise. Search parties were sent. Beach patrols increased. Coastal waters scanned. But Barb was already slipping away. No margin for error. Barb remained submerged for long, exhausting hours. Battery power slowly draining. Air growing stale. Humidity rising. Inside submarines of World War II, conditions were brutal. There was no air conditioning. Diesel fumes lingered. Sweat mixed with oil and machinery. Men slept near torpedoes. Food storage shared space with weapons. Privacy did not exist. And yet morale remained astonishingly high, because they had done something no one else had. They had taken the war directly onto Japanese soil, and lived. Fluckey's mindset. Eugene Fluckey was not reckless. He was calculated. There's a difference. Reckless men gamble. Calculated men prepare. Every patrol he commanded followed that philosophy. Before Nam Quan Harbor, he studied tide charts for weeks. Before rocket attacks, he analyzed coastal maps obsessively. Before landing men on Karafuto, he rehearsed contingencies over and over inside the submarine. He once said that boldness without preparation was stupidity. Barb was bold, but never stupid. The final rocket strikes. Even after the train sabotage, Barb was not finished. Fluckey believed momentum mattered. If Japan was confused now, he wanted to deepen that confusion. In the following days, Barb launched additional rocket strikes along the coast. Industrial facilities, warehouses, shipyards. Each time, surface, aim, fire 12 rockets, submerge, disappear. Japanese coastal defenses were stretched thin. Radar struggled to detect a low-profile submarine at night. Searchlights scanned empty ocean. Patrol boats chased shadows. The psychological pressure mounted. The sea no longer felt like protection. It felt like vulnerability. The crew's perspective. For the men aboard Barb, every surface rocket attack was terrifying. To fire rockets, the submarine had to remain exposed. Engines running. Deck crew outside. Completely vulnerable. If an aircraft appeared overhead, if artillery shells landed close, if a patrol boat rounded the coast unexpectedly, there would be no time. Yet they trusted their captain. Trust inside a submarine is absolute. There is no escape hatch for doubt. You either believe in the man giving orders, or you don't survive. And the crew of Barb believed in Fluckey completely. The weight of command. Commanding a submarine in World War II was one of the loneliest jobs in the military. When a submarine sinks, everyone dies. There are no lifeboats, no second chances. Fluckey carried that knowledge every patrol. 80 lives, 80 families, all depending on his decisions. When he chose to land men in Japan, he understood what failure meant, but he also understood something else. The war would not be won by caution alone. The broader war. By July 1945, the Pacific War was entering its final phase. American forces had captured Okinawa. 29 bombers were firebombing Tokyo. The Manhattan Project was nearing completion. Japan's navy was crippled. Merchant shipping nearly destroyed. Yet Japanese resistance remained fierce. The invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall, was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. Every act of disruption mattered. Every supply train destroyed mattered. Every psychological blow mattered. Barb's actions, though small in scale, carried enormous symbolic weight. They proved that even the Japanese homeland was not untouchable. The end approaches. In early August 1945, Barb concluded her 12th patrol. She had sunk or damaged multiple vessels, conducted rocket bombardments, landed a sabotage team on enemy soil, destroyed a military train, returned with 0 casualties. It was an unprecedented record. Shortly after, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war ended. Barb returned home, not just as a submarine, but as a legend. Recognition. Eugene Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Nam Quan Harbor attack earlier in the war. But among submariners, the Karafuto train sabotage became almost mythical. The only ground combat mission carried out by American forces on the Japanese home islands during World War II, executed by sailors, from a submarine, at night, without loss. USS Barb would go on to serve through the early Cold War, before eventually being decommissioned. But her legacy was sealed in 1945. For presidential unit citations, 8 battle stars, a reputation for audacity unmatched in submarine history. Why this story matters. War stories often focus on massive invasions, carrier battles, bombing raids, but sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones. A small rubber raft, 8 volunteers, a single charge beneath steel rails, and a submarine waiting in darkness. History remembers large armies, but it is shaped by small teams willing to attempt the impossible. And perhaps the most remarkable part? When asked later about landing men on Japanese soil, Fluckey downplayed it. He simply said they were looking for targets. To him, it was another mission. To history, it was something else entirely. It was proof that courage, preparation, and imagination can change the shape of war. When a hatch finally opened and fresh Pacific air rushed inside USS Barb, no one spoke about history. They were too tired, too dirty, too aware of how close it had been. The men who had stepped onto Japanese soil that night didn't see themselves as heroes. They were sailors, engine men, radio men, gunners' mates, not commandos, not Marines, not special forces. And yet, they carried out the only Allied ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands during the entire war. And they had done it from a submarine. The quiet aftermath, back in Pearl Harbor, there was no grand parade for the trained sabotage team. No headlines screamed their names. Submarine warfare was secretive by nature. Missions stayed classified. Details were buried in patrol reports. Even families often didn't know what their sons had done. The 8 volunteers returned to routine duty. Maintenance, watch rotations, battery checks, diesel inspections, as if they hadn't just detonated a Japanese military train hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. That's the strange thing about war. History-changing moments often feel ordinary to the men inside them. The captain who refused to play it safe. Eugene Fluckey never chased glory. He chased opportunity. Most commanders in July 1945 were thinking about survival. The war was almost over. One mistake could erase everything. A submarine lost in shallow water near Japan would have been catastrophic. But Fluckey believed something simple. If you see an opportunity to strike, and you're prepared, you take it. That mindset defined USS Barb's entire war record. 17 ships sunk under his command, daring penetrations into heavily defended harbors, rocket attacks on the Japanese mainland, and finally, boots on enemy soil. The psychological blow. Militarily, one destroyed train would not collapse Japan. But psychologically, it was devastating. Japan had told its people the homeland was secure, protected by sea, guarded by the Imperial Navy. Yet an American submarine had approached undetected, launched rockets on the towns, landed men on shore, destroyed military infrastructure, escaped without a single casualty. That wasn't just damage. It was humiliation. And in the final months of war, humiliation mattered because it eroded confidence. It eroded certainty. It eroded the illusion of safety. The war ends. Just weeks after Barb's final patrol, everything changed. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki. Then silence. The Emperor announced Japan's surrender. For the crew of Barb, the war ended not in combat, but in reflection. They had pushed boundaries. They had risked everything. And they had survived. Many submarines hadn't. World War II submarine service had one of the highest casualty rates of any branch in the U.S. military. Over 3,500 American submariners never came home. Barb did. The boat that refused limits. USS Barb would continue serving into the Cold War. She would later be converted into a guided missile submarine, but her legend was sealed in 1945 for Presidential Unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Medal of Honor captain, and a mission so unique that even decades later, naval historians still pause when telling it, because it sounds almost fictional. A submarine, a rubber raft, 8 volunteers, a train exploding in the night, and a silent escape beneath black water. The men behind the myth. What makes the story powerful isn't just the explosion, it's the humanity. Picture it, a young sailor, barely in his 20s, heart pounding, foreign soil beneath his boots. Knowing capture means torture, or worse. Hearing a train approach in the darkness, feeling the ground shake, then running for the shoreline with nothing but moonlight and adrenaline guiding him. No backup, no extraction team, just faith that their submarine would be waiting. That kind of courage doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. Why we remember. World War II is filled with massive battles. Normandy, Midway, Iwo Jima. But sometimes the most unforgettable stories are the quiet ones. The ones that almost didn't happen. The ones that required imagination more than firepower. USS Barb didn't win the war alone, but she proved something important. Innovation can be as powerful as numbers. Preparation can be as deadly as size. And sometimes, the boldest strike comes from the smallest platform. The final image. Imagine the Pacific at night. Calm, endless, empty. Beneath the surface, a submarine glides silently. Inside, 80 men move through narrow steel corridors. No one outside knows where they are. No one on shore knows they were ever there. But somewhere along a quiet stretch of track in Karafuto, twisted steel still tells a story. A reminder that in 1945, the war reached Japan's soil in a way no one expected. Not from an invasion fleet, not from an airborne assault, but from a submarine captain who refused to think small. And that's the story of USS Barb, the submarine that didn't just hunt ships. It hunted the impossible.